Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I see we're live. Today, we are going to cover ratio questions. I have a good batch of questions I want to do with everybody. Ratios, as you probably know now, are a big part of GMAT focus, not only because you see them in the quant section, but also because they are very relevant in data insights, not just in data sufficiency. You can see them in graphics interpretation, two-part analysis, table analysis, even in some MSR. So it's a very good question type to have down. What we're going to cover today is a little bit of data sufficiency, a little bit of problem solving. So before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about just some quant strategy when you're studying, and how to kind of structure certain components of your prep. So what I'm going to do here is just share my screen so we can get into the presentation here. So we'll talk a little bit about that. As we're doing the questions, I'll tell you to put the answer to the question in the chat box so I can see it. So let's dive in here. So, one of the first big things is let me get it in presentation mode, sorry. Just about excelling at GMAT math in general. It's a big thing that everybody has to think about when they're studying for the GMAT. So I have three important steps, and a lot of these are kind of the mental component of studying for the GMAT. So step one, and this is a tip for things you're doing in life regardless, eliminate self-talk, right? So, the GMAT is probably new to most of you when you start out. It's a grueling process. There's ups, there's downs, there's twists, there's turns when you're studying. And you just really need to be ready for that. But what you can't do is get down on yourself. You can't get negative. You need to make sure you're always keeping a positive attitude. Because here's the thing. There's going to be bad days when you're studying. There's going to be down days. There's going to be days where maybe you can't necessarily see the clearing through the trees, right? But irrespective of that, you just need to make sure you're in a position where you say to yourself, all right, look, I understand very well that this maybe is a bad day, but I'm going to look at it positively and say there's always tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to be a better day. The day after that's going to be better. So bad days, frustrating days, this is all part of the study process. And again, this isn't different from things in life, like when you're in school or when you're at a job. You have to try to stay positive. You need to find the bright spots in what you're doing. And if you can do that, it's going to make the process that much better for you from beginning to end. Now, step two, outwork the competition. This one should be obvious. Again, this isn't anything new and different than what you've been told in life. If you play an instrument, if you're in school dealing with academics, if you play a sport, anything that you do that's competing against other people, such as the GMAT or any standardized exam, you want to make sure you outwork the competition. Yes, are there people who cannot outwork the competition and do really well in the GMAT? There are, but most of us aren't that. That's not me. Like, I had to work really, really hard at the GMAT to improve in the GMAT, and that's usually the way this goes for most people. So you've got to make sure you're working harder and trying to work harder than the people to the left and right of you. Now, look, doesn't mean you need to ask your friends, how much are you studying for the GMAT? Or ask your coworkers, how much are you studying for the GMAT? You don't have to necessarily do any of that. However, you do want to be in a position where you're just working as hard as possible. A lot of times we say, hey, try to do, 18 hours a week, right? That's a nice number for me that I suggest to students. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of time, and you've got to find the time to do it. But again, if you're working hard and you're doing the things you need to do, your GMAT prep should work out the way that it needs to in the end, meaning you should be able to hit your goal score because that hard work will mean something, okay? So always focus on working as hard as possible from beginning to end of your GMAT. And heck, that's going to make it so, you're a little bit more efficient in getting there, right? Now, step three, recognize discomfort as growth, okay? So similar to what we said in step one, where there's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. Well, learning something new is always going to provide a level of discomfort, right? Because you're going to be in a position where things are new and things are uncomfortable, right? But if you only focus on the things that are making you comfortable as opposed to uncomfortable, then you're not growing, right? Because if you're only focusing on your strengths, for example, your strengths are going to get incrementally better. But if you never focus on your weaknesses, how are you going to improve overall in the macro? Well, the fact is you're just not. And that's a problem, right? So you need to take those discomforts and you need to embrace them and say, well, this is great because the things that I'm struggling with, I'm going to make better. They're going to become my strengths as opposed to my weaknesses. And by doing that, that's going to help move you along the process. And yes, again, there's going to be days where those discomforts are at a max and you're not going to like it. It's not going to feel great. But if you can take a step back and say, well, that's growth, then you're in a position where you're moving forward the way you need to. So don't hit those head on. Don't try to push them aside and say, I'm going to get to them later or anything like that. Now, if any of you guys have questions as I'm going through this, feel free to throw them in the chat box and I can certainly answer them as we're going through. I'm going to talk about one more thing, then we're going to get into a couple ratio questions or about 5 of them. And then after that, if we have more questions, we can also chat then as well. Now, this is just about timing strategies, and these are some big things about timing on the GMAT in general that you need to be careful of. Strive for excellence, not perfection. Well, what does that mean? It just means you can't, some people can be perfect on the quant section. Most of us aren't. So you can't strive for that, because if you strive for perfection, what's going to happen is you're never going to give up on any questions. You're not. And what that's going to do is that's going to crush your timing throughout the rest of the quant section. And that's the same thing for all of these sections, not just quant, but data insights and verbal as well. Over investing in the first 10 questions. Yeah, I get it. If you get the first 3 questions wrong, what we've seen with the GMAT algorithm is that it's tough and it could hurt. But the problem is, if you get those right and then flounder at the end because you spent 6 minutes on each of those first 3 questions, or you spent 70% of your time on the first 10, you're going to get dinged on the back end. So you got to be really careful that you're not just thinking that doing well in those first 10 questions is going to set the algorithm in motion, and whatever happens on the last 10 won't matter. It's not going to be like that. So you're going to have to find the right balance for you, and you will during your practice exams and stuff like that. But you can't just focus on those without thinking about what the repercussions are after those first 10 questions. Now, losing a battle to win the war. Well, that goes back to striving for excellence, not perfection, okay? If you're 2 minutes into a question and you're like, I have no shot. Well, chances are you should have said that when you're a minute and a half or even a minute into the question. Because remember, you can also go back and review some questions at the end. But you can't just get so entrenched in a question and so unwilling to give up on a question that you just let it crush the rest of your section. In other words, losing or not losing the battle, winning the battle, because if you win the battle, you lose the war. What we're saying is lose the battle, lose that question, be in a better spot for the rest of the quant section. That's winning the war. And you might say, well, what happens if I do that with 6, 7 questions? Well, if you do, that means you're probably not in a place to successfully get through GMAT Quant as it stands. And there's probably other things at play than just strategies of getting through the section itself. And as far as timing goes too, you don't want to just throw out questions. You don't want to say, well, I'm 2 minutes behind. If I throw out question 13, I'm back on track. There's a lot of issues with that, because if you throw them out, it could be an easy question and it could very well just decimate your score a bit. And you certainly don't want that. So you got to at least give it some time, maybe 30 seconds to then kind of get your bearings with the question and say, well, is this one of those questions that just seems nuts that I'm not necessarily going to get even within 2 to 3 minutes? And if that's the case, then you guess and you move on. But you don't just throw it out to throw it out, because that's very, very problematic depending on the difficulty of the question. And then, of course, you have to answer every question. I'm sure if any of you guys have been perusing GMAT Club, you've seen GMAT Quant scores get crushed by not answering every question, by leaving one of them blank. Don't do that. Make sure at a bare minimum, it's a guess. So even if you have 1 minute for 2 questions, even if you want to spend 45 seconds on one of them, when you go into the next question, don't even bother trying to read it and give an educated guess. Put an answer, confirm the answer, so that way you're in a position where you're not leaving anything blank, because yeah, that would be unfortunate if you dropped by a few points just from leaving something blank when you had the time actually to fully answer it. All right, so that is, well, actually, we have a couple more things with timing strategies, and then we'll get into ratios. So checking your work can happen. Some people try it. It just doesn't work. I wish we had time to check our work. That means you have to feel okay being 80% certain that you're right. Because usually we want that comfortable feeling of, I want to be 100% certain that I did this problem correctly. You can't. And anyone who tells me they checked their work and didn't do well, I point to that and I say, that's the issue. So don't do that. Don't do it in your practice. Don't do it in your practice tests. You've got to get used to just feeling okay that you followed the right processes and answered a question correctly. Now, developing an internal time clock to help with pacing, that's important, because you kind of need to know when you're at that 2-minute mark or around there, because you're not going to be staring at the clock while you're doing these questions. It's the same thing with developing a progress clock, where you can kind of say, all right, we're getting close to when I should start thinking about whether or not I'm going to move on from this question. But you got to practice that. You can practice with a timer, whatever it is. You want to be in a position where you can have that down. And then just having an overall timing strategy. We have a couple here. We've written blogs about them. There's different ways to calculate your timing, what you have left. You can set up your grid if you want, or you can look at how many questions are left, figuring out how much time should be remaining for those questions. Whatever the strategy is, you just need to feel very comfortable with it, right? And you need to feel like you're in a situation where it'll work on test day and you'll use it on test day. The last thing you want to do is have a strategy down, use it in your practice exams, and then not use it on your actual GMAT. So those are just a few nuggets about GMAT Quant on the test, on your prep. Certainly, if you have questions at the end about all this, we can talk about them. But I want to get into ratios. So as I said, ratios is a really big topic on the GMAT. Now, I just have very strategic questions I want to do with you guys. I think the best way to deal with this is for me to give everybody a couple minutes to do the question on your own, maybe 2 minutes or so. When you have the answer to the question, put it in the chat box so I can see that you have an answer, and then we can go through the solution. So I'll give you guys 2 minutes to work on this question now, and then we'll talk about it. All right, I see some good answers coming in. This one might not have been too hard for everybody, but I want to just talk about a process that I find to be very useful and helpful for a problem like this. Okay, so a lot of you guys are getting it right. Now, one of the things I love to teach my students, we teach our students at TTP, is the ratio multiplier. Such a great way to set up these ratios, especially when equations are involved, right? So when I set this up, lions, tigers, bears, and hopefully you guys can see my writing on the screen. It's 3x. It's not 3, 8 to 10. It's 3x, 8x, 10x. Okay, so what we've done is we've gotten these ratios in terms of the same variable. To me, again, very important here. And being able to do that allows us to then set up a very clean equation, right? So now if we know there are 20 more tigers than lions, well, tigers is the bigger value. That's 8x, so it's equal to 3x plus 20. 5x is equal to 20. X is equal to 4. So we want to know how many bears are in the zoo. Well, as we go to our ratio, bears is 10x. 10 times 4 is 40. And there's your answer. So to me, this is a super clean, easy way to deal with ratios when they're involved in equations. And what's nice too, which we'll see in the next question, is how this can come to play with the form of data sufficiency. Now, remember, as I always tell my students, I know there are multiple ways to deal with things. So if you dealt with this a slightly different way, it's not the end of the world. But we're in a position, let me go back here. Even though you may have done something differently here, if you feel like your process works and it's going to work across the board for some of these questions, then that's all that matters, right? So keep in mind that that's important, that whatever process you follow for certain questions, you want it to work regardless of the question type. You want it to work in many instances, in many scenarios. And for example, this is why I like using ratio multipliers, because I can use it in a lot of different positions and places. So again, I know this one wasn't too bad for you all, but I just wanted to highlight the idea of the ratio multiplier. All right, let's get into this question here. And of course, you can see that this one is data sufficiency. Let's talk about this. I'll give you guys a couple minutes and we will discuss. I see some answers coming in. I'll give you guys another minute here. All right, I think that's good. So yes, the answer to this is D. And I'm hoping, and you guys can tell me in the chat box, if you guys used ratio multipliers to start. Because what we see here, and the key is that it says that each ring is directly proportional to the number of diamonds in the ring, and each diamond costs X dollars. So if we're setting up a ratio here, well, we have ring 1 to ring 2 to ring 3. And then we know how many diamonds are in each one. So ring 1 would have to be 5x. Ring 2 is 4x. Ring 3 is 3x. Now, the question is, once you have this and you know that you have everything in terms of the variable it needs to be in terms of, which is the x, do you even have to write out statement 1 and statement 2? Or can you say, you know what? I know that 5x plus 4x equaling 18,000 is going to allow me to solve for x. And remember, all we need to know is what 5x equals. So there's an element of doing a lot of good work on the front end and then not wasting your time coming to an exact answer on the back end in data sufficiency. This is one of those times. Why write out 5x plus 4x equals 18,000, solve for x, say you have x, plug it back in for x and multiply by 5? That's just wasteful. You don't need to do that. Same with statement 2. Now, if you feel like you have to write it out, write it out. But I feel like here, if you did this, there's really no need to. So for example, saying that 4x minus 3x is equal to 2,000, I don't think that's necessary. You should be able to see that and say, okay, I have what I need to be able to solve here. And therefore, statement 2 is sufficient. And of course, the answer is D. So, we talked about timing on the GMAT. These are the places where you can organically catch up in time, right? Like if you can do this question, which some of you did in about 45 seconds, notice you'll catch up on time here. Now, obviously, this would be in the data insight section. So you would be using that time to maybe save it for other more harder, integrated reasoning type questions like MSR. But it just goes to show that there are pockets and places where you can do things a little bit quicker. So again, using the ratio multiplier is very easy to see that each statement alone is sufficient. All right, moving on. I have two very similar questions we're going to do in a row, and we're going to kind of compare and contrast them as we get to each one, but we're going to do each one individually. So again, I'll give you guys a few minutes, and then we'll discuss here. To answer your question, there's never going to be contradictions on the GMAT. So you're gonna have to get the same values. Now, if you don't, what that would mean is you probably made a math mistake, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's insufficient. If that makes sense. All right, so I'll give you guys another minute. I see some different answers are rolling in here. And keep in mind, a lot of the stuff that we talk about in ratios carries over to percentages and fractions and stuff like that, because it's the same concept. Like if you can get a ratio of something, you can get a percentage of something. So this could very well have percentages in it, and we're going to get the same answer. Now, I see a lot of different answers coming in to the chat. So let's talk about this. We have we're going to have to come up with 4 variables because we've got our red wine, and unfortunately, I don't have a ton of space to write. So I'm going to try to be as small as possible with writing some of this out. So our red wine, what's the revenue of red wine? We're going to call that R times X. R is the dollars per case. I'll just put a little dollar sign next to it so we can remember what that variable stands for. X is the number of cases, right? White, W dollars per case times variable Y. We want to know ratio of red to white. So we want to know what Rx over WY equals, right? So really, the key in these types of questions is, can I get everything in terms of the same variable, and can the variables just drop? Now, it should be very clear that statement 1 on its own isn't going to be sufficient, and statement 2 on its own isn't going to be sufficient because we're only dealing with half of the variables in each statement. For example, in statement 1, the vineyard sold 4 times as many cases of red as white. That means X is equal to 4Y. Even if we sub in, it's not enough information. We've still got our R's and our W's there. Those certainly aren't canceling out. Statement 2, they sold each case of white wine, okay, for 50 more than each red. Again, not going to be enough information, but let's analyze these together, right? So when we sub in X for 4Y, we'll do it down here under answer choice C. When we sub in X for 4Y, we have R times 4Y in the top, right? In the bottom, we're going to put in 50 plus R for W. So that's 50 plus R times Y, right? Now, right off the bat, the Y's go away. It's WY because we have to put a variable for the number of cases of white wine sold. It's not clear that they sold the same number of cases. So there's white wine cases sold and red wine cases sold. Okay, so moving on, the Y's cancel. What are we left with? We're left with 4R over 50 plus R. Now, do those R's cancel out? They do not. These R's remain where they're going to remain, and they don't go away because of the plus in the denominator. Therefore, the answer here has to be E. There's no way to get an answer if those R's don't go away. So E is our answer. This is a medium to hard question, I'd say. Medium to hard. So take a mental snapshot of this, and I'm going to give you another question that's going to look very similar, but it's not exactly similar. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes, and then we'll talk about this one here. Yeah, I think you guys are seeing exactly why I gave you this question and all that good stuff. Yeah, you guys are understanding this completely. Now, keep in mind, this is a super cool thing to have tucked away, a tool in your toolbox, because honestly, like if you're in a situation where you got to be taking a guess and you see something like this, and you see you've got every variable counted for in some sort of multiplication form, it's going to work. Everything is going to cancel out. Okay, that's always going to happen in this situation. I don't even know if we have to do it out. I feel like you guys understand exactly what's happening, because the one thing, and if we're going back to the last question, you don't have that pesky addition sign. Because remember, if it was 4R over 50R, we would have been set. But it's not. It's 4R over 50 plus R. That's the problem. That's why this one is E. That's why this one is C. And it's like I said, if they changed this and said the percent increase of red wine revenue to white wine revenue is what, this would also be solvable. And that's super cool. If they wanted percent change, solvable. If they wanted fraction of, solvable. So understanding that these are all related to each other is important, because they can take the same concepts and throw a percent in there, and it shouldn't affect you in the least. So hopefully you guys are clearly seeing now why one of these is C and one of these is E. So cool thing to understand. We have all these in the TTP course too. So, certainly you could check them out there in our ratios chapter as well. All right, we have 2 more questions here, and I want to teach a little bit about substituting real values in to help with some of these ratio type questions. So I'll give you guys another minute or two, and then we can chat about this here. All right, see some answers rolling in here. Now, out of curiosity, I know there's a couple different ways to deal with this. Did anyone plug in any real values for the total to just work with real numbers? If you did, you can respond in the chat box. As you're responding, I'm just going to set up my equation here. So 1/2 convertibles equals 1/5 total, and then 1/4 rather, sport is equal to 1/8 total. Now, I will say this problem isn't that bad as far as, do I need to plug in real numbers? I will tell you, though, that there are tougher ones on the GMAT. And there's this older question in the official guide that I think comes to mind. It's about night workers and day workers with boxes, where if you keep it within variables, it gets a little yucky. We're going to see a question. The next final question is going to be similar, where plugging in real numbers is a great way to deal with it because it just makes things cleaner. Now, if you're someone who likes using real numbers, you could have said T is 40, right? Well, that would mean 1/2 C is equal to 1/5 of 40, which is 8, or C is equal to 16. You would then say 1/4 S is equal to 1/8 of 40, which is going to be 5. That means S is equal to 20, C is equal to 16. Ratio of convertibles of sports cars is C over S. That's 16 to 20, which ultimately is 4 to 5 in answer A. So if you liked this process, and maybe this is a process you're not used to dealing with, it's a great way to deal with it. The answer to your question is no. It wouldn't consume a lot more time, because you should within about 5 seconds know that T is the LCM of 5 and 8. And once you do that, doing that math is very clean and easy. I'm not saying you have to plug in numbers here, but I'm saying if you can get used to doing it in certain situations, it can be advantageous. And that's going to bring us to the final question here. Okay. Final question here is similar, but there's going to be more equations that we have to deal with. So let's see what you guys come up with here. And just keep in mind, that's a 1/4 right here. It's a little bit jagged. Let's see what you come up with in this question here. And again, there's multiple ways to deal with it, and go about however you want. I'm not saying you have to plug in these situations. I'm just giving you an option. So if things that you do, you feel confident with, awesome. You know what I mean? Like, continue to do things out the way that, you feel like you should. So anyway, work through this and let's see what you come up with. Okay, I see some answers rolling in here. All right, and I'm curious if anyone did plug in real values for this or not as you're coming up with your answers. Okay. All right. And again, that's totally fine. I'm going to show you that method here. I think it's a cool method to deal with this problem here. So we've got our 4 bagels, right? Plain, raisin, onion, everything. Now let's do our equation. So if there are 1/4 as many plain bagels, or excuse me, 1/4 as many everything as plain, that means P over 4 is equal to the everything bagel, right? 2, there are 5 times as many plain as raisins. So that would mean 5R is equal to P, right? Now, if we want to get everything in terms of P, we would probably say R is equal to P over 5, right? 3 is there's an equal number of onion and raisin bagels. Now, if we have P over 4 is equal to E, right? And we have P over 6 is equal, or excuse me, P over 5 is equal to R, a very easy number for P could be 20. Now, 20 over 4 is 5, so that means E is 5, right? 20 over 5 is 4, so R would be 4, right? And then, of course, onion would be 4, and we already said at the beginning that plain, oops, excuse me, 4, not 40. Let me just erase that. Eraser, there we go. There we go. Then P is 20, okay? Now, plain and raisin bagels are what fraction of the total? Okay, plain is 20, raisin is 4, right? Plain bagels, raisin bagels, that's 24. The total number of bagels is 5 plus 4 plus 4, so that's going to be 9, 13, and then 33. So when we divide that out, 8 goes into 24, excuse me, 3 goes into 24 8 times, 3 goes into 33 11 times. 8 over 11 is the answer, and it's C. So look, you could have still plugged in the fractions, but to me, on the test, the clock is ticking, and there's fractions involved and all this stuff, and then you got to get common denominators or multiply through the expression. To me, this is a great way to deal with something that's a little bit convoluted and it's a little bit quicker. Plugging in P for 20 should have been obvious once you knew it was a multiple of 4 and 5. So that is the last question I wanted to do with everybody today. Do you guys have any questions? And these questions can span anything from what we did here today, also to things about your prep, your quant prep, etc. But hopefully, you guys can take some of the tools we talked about here and use them. We have a lot of this stuff in the TTP course too, and there's also a lot more about ratios that we haven't covered in this webinar, but this was a nice taste of some things that I think are good to know about ratios. So with that said, are there any questions anyone has? I don't do the checkpoint method, actually. My method is just looking at how much time is left and then multiplying by 2. Excuse me, how many questions are left, multiplying by 2, and look at the timer. I mean, you can do the math out. It's just if you're saying 2 minutes per question, do the math and then subtract from the amount of time you're given. We have a pretty cool blog on that, actually, about quant timing strategies you can check out, where we give some suggestions there. The best way to choose a number is always do the LCM, right? Like here, P is a multiple of 4 and 5. The LCM of 4 and 5 is 20. Here, T is a multiple of 5 and 8. The LCM of 5 and 8 is 40. You always go with the LCM, always, for the value that you're trying to determine the ratio of. Any other questions? All right, well, if that is it, how to decide which question to pick. I'm not sure what that means exactly. All right, so if that's it from everybody, thank you for attending. Thank you for participating. And like I said, hopefully you guys learned a thing or two. I'm sure this recording will be live on GMAT Club soon. If you want more ratio help, check out TTP. Check out our trial. It's all there. It's full access. There's a lot of great stuff packed in that chapter. Feel free to reach out to us if you need anything. Have a safe, healthy rest of your week. And I'm sure you guys will be seeing me here soon on GMAT Club. So thanks again, everybody. And we will talk soon. Have a good day.